Tuesday, October 5th, and we're getting into our last story that we're going to be doing together called The Lottery, which we'll do a wee bit of talky stuff first. If you're a home child, make sure you go find it, download it, or listen to the story in my melodic voice, whichever works best for you. We do visit the book fair on Thursday of this week. It'll only be about 15 minutes that we're going to be there. It'll be a small part of the class period. You're welcome to go around and look for stuff. If you find a thing you want and you did not bring money with you, then you can go back on Friday after you finish the test. Or you can go during a passing period, and that's also fine with me. Either of those works, I think. And you can also go ahead of that. If you want to go during this week, you're welcome to go during a passing period, and you can just stop in there and stuff like that if you find a book that you want, and that is good with me. If you'd like me to torture you, please make sure that you have your iPad out, because as it says up there, your iPad's only out if you're standing to work on homework. Unless you want to stand to work on homework, you just have to let me know, and dreams can come true. The green story, that is what Friday's test is going to be. Friday's test is 25 questions. Of those, roughly 13 of them are going to be about that story. And then the other 12 are just going to be like random skills that you've had to learn, like irony and foreshadowing and stuff like that as we go through. You only have the class period to take the test, so whatever you don't get done by the end, you just turn in and then go wee, and then you should be good to go. My goal is for those of you who have read story and prepared, you should be done really speedily and have lots of free time, but we have to prepare for the kids who struggle, just to give you the heads-up-y things from there. Bowen?
For the 9-week test, are we going to be able to retake that?
I have not talked about that yet. Is that on the screen yet? Silly Bowen. Taylin? I know, I swapped the I's and the O's to see who was paying attention. Nika? Nope, this is more like all of our previous quizzes, where you have to go through. It's got multiple choice, it's got short answer things and stuff like that. So yeah, it's just because it's written by me, so it's just like all the previous ones that I've created for you, whether that's good or bad. And yes, the 9-week assessments from yesterday are all graded, and they're all on Skyward. If you've not looked at your grade, I'll give you a minute, then you can go ahead now, even though I sent it out on Remind for kids paying attention, but I'll be nice to you if you need to go take a look at it, and we can help you out from there. As far as 9-week assessment went, if you did not do well, it pretty much came down to one thing. The same thing has come down to every quiz, which is? Directions. Yeah, it came down to following directions, which was the same thing on this one. It came down to following directions. It's weird. It's like this thing I keep trying to beat into you guys over and over again. Those of you who followed directions, you did really well. Those of you who didn't follow directions, it was a bit more of a struggle. The main thing being, most of the points all came from question 3. That was 13 of your 15. And yes, if you go on Skyward, it's a 30-point thing because it goes in as a double grade because it's like a 9-week assessment. Of that paragraph you had to write, you had to reference the articles throughout the whole thing. All of your reasons, and you had to have 3 of them, came from the articles. I was looking for you to talk about obesity, or you had to talk about muscle cramping, or you had to talk about lack of sleep. And so there was like 4 things you could mention, and you had to mention at least 3 of them, and then you had to talk about the article in some way. Some of you guys only mentioned one thing. Some of you guys mentioned multiple things. They all just came from your imagination. Others of you guys were just creative and just went all over the place. That basically what came down to. Those of you who gave me an introduction, gave me a conclusion, referenced the article, you did really well. And that's kind of what it came down to. Yes, I will give you a chance to fix it and bring your grade up to like a C. If you got lower than a C, then you'll be able to fix it, and I'll show you guys how to do that later this week. The drawback will be is there is a time limit because grades lock, I think, Monday. So you only have until then to get it done, but we'll show you guys how to do it from there. Questions aside from how do we go about doing fixie thing? We're good to go on fixie thing? Yaysies. All right. And we only have one more grade in this 9 weeks, which will be this Friday's test. And that's the last one. And then we get to reset your grades all the way back down to 0, and we get to begin all over again. Yay, grades. Gotcha. No one in here to torture. Go you guys from there. And to here'sy bits, now we do. Home children, I'm going to pause in a second in case we have volunteers who want to try and get points. But again, this is the bonus round where now you have to try and get under 11 seconds. So far, I've only had 2 kids complete it in under 11 seconds. One kid got it at 10.9 or something like that. And then the other kid was at 6 point something, 6.2. And those are my 2 that I have so far. Once I get a fastest kid from each class, I will then start listing them over there for you guys to see. Home children, I'm going to pause, and then we'll come back to you. Hang on. Continuing on, we did not get anyone officially on there. Our fastest time was 12 something in here? 12. 14 something? 12 something. We did 12 and a 14, and then 2 not quite getting there. But eventually, someday. All right. To this part. So this is what today's story is going to connect with. We have to know what traditions are to understand this story. So the first one is, do you guys know what traditions are?
Yeah.
Nod your heads all up and down. The idea being it's like a thing you do gesundheit every year at the same time or every day at the same time. Like fourth period, there is something you're supposed to do at the start of every fourth period every day, which would be supposed to be the announcements, and it's supposed to be the pledge. That's supposed to be like your traditional start to fourth period. You stand up, say the pledge, and then you do the announcements. So that's like an everyday tradition. You also have ones that you do like every year, like on the day of your birth. What is the tradition on birthdays?
Christmas.
Celebrate Christmas.
You cry.
How do we celebrate it?
By crying that you're getting older. Especially people your age.
Party.
Typically, it's going to be a cake with the candle. I'm sorry, I didn't realize you guys had never had birthdays before. Someday, hopefully, people around you celebrate the fact that you exist, and you'll get one of these little things called, I believe the kids call them birthday cakes. I think I saw that on TikTok. And so that'll be a thing that we have. The thing is, do you guys know why we do candles and cake on a birthday?
Fire.
To represent the
How many of you don't care as long as you get your cake? All right, just thought I'd check on that one. So then to continue that same theme, this month we have a holiday coming up which has traditions connected to it. That holiday being Halloween. What is our tradition connected to it?
Hallows Eve.
So wait. There you go. The fact that you dress up in a costume type thing and then people throw sugar bits at you. How many of you know why we started wearing costumes on Halloween?
Hide from the witches.
I'm sorry. I said how many of you, not yell it at me. Silly children. How many of you know why we give sugar bits to kids on Halloween? How many of you could care less as long as you get to dress up and people throw sugar bits at you? Okay. Let's jump to another one. Christmas. I'm aware it is connected to the Christian holiday with that one Jesus fellow who came around. But that is not the tradition that is connected to Christmas. What is the tradition that most people connect to Christmas? Presents. Where do you put the presents? Under the tree. What goes on the fireplace?
Fire.
So with that one, Jesus was not born under a tree, nor was he plucked off the tree like a little baby apple. Do you guys know why we put trees inside of our house? Do you know why we staple socks to wood?
Yes.
Yeah.
Again, how many of you guys don't care as long as there's presents underneath of it? All right. So that's what we're going to get to with today's story, is that apparently you're familiar with traditions. Most of you just don't care what the tradition is, as long as, or how it came about, as long as you get to participate in tradition. You're just like, like with Valentine's Day, and the fact that, by the way, this is not what the human heart is shaped like. If you were to rip one out, you wouldn't pull like out of someone's chest like, oh my God, they nailed it. It's not what it looks like. It's completely different. So the idea of why would we have this shape connected to Valentine's Day, and why would they pick February 14th? For most of you, again, not a thing you care about. You just want to know how it connects. The reason I'm beating all of this into you is with today's story, there's going to come a moment in the story where you guys all look at me and go, why? Why, Mr. Brovicast? Why? And I'm going to go, do you remember the conversation we had about traditions? And you'll go, yeah, Fine. And so this is that moment I get to refer back to later. Taylin.
Are you going to tell us why we do those things?
No, I have no idea either. All I know is it connects to our story about the fact that people don't care about why we do traditions. We just care about doing the tradition. I looked them up, and so I've like most of those. I now know why because I went through and did the research, but it's more time to go into right now. What you guys have is this wonderful thing called an iPad, and you have this thing today called Best, and you have this thing called Boredom, and you can go googly, 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 and you can Google it yourself.
We also have this thing called homework.
We do. Well, to each their own. Some kids choose not to do it. Bowen.
Can you give us like a TLDR from Christmas?
Yes. The TLDR is suspense. Do you guys know what suspense is?
Yeah.
What? For those of you who have enjoyed the game, the TV show Squid Game, without yelling at me, Squid Game worked really big on suspense when you had all the games that went into it, and there was even one episode, I think it was like episode 3 or 4, where it ends right in the middle of a game and you can't figure out who wins until it goes, I think it was the tug of war one, and then you can't figure out who wins until all of a sudden it starts the next episode, and that ending of one episode and you're like, what? No! That's suspense. That moment of being really interested in the story and wanting to know what happens next.
All TV shows.
What part of the mountain does suspense come in?
Rising action.
It's the rising action. It's the part that keeps you interested. Once the climax has happened, then we've lost interest, because then it goes in that boring falling action stuff. It's the rising action that keeps you in. Throughout all of Squid Game, until you find out who wins it, you're just like, who's it gonna be? Who's it gonna? Oh, that's who. And so that becomes our rising action events. Foreshadowing. What's foreshadowing also? And I've given you several stories which do not have an ending, and you have to use foreshadowing to figure it out. This is not one of them. This one has a definite ending to it. It's just before we get to definite ending, because again, I've not given you the last page because I've learned not to trust children, you're going to pick up on foreshadowing before we get to the ending. Much like with some of our previous stories where you guys all picked up on little clues, and you're like, Mr. Brovicast, I have a feeling. In this story, there's a good chance you're going to get a feeling of some kind.
Yeah, it's gonna get blown up.
And then, what's our definition of exposition?
Beginning stuff.
Unfortunately, almost the entire first page of this story is exposition. It is a lot. So I'm going to power through that. It's needed because the end of the story doesn't make sense without it. So if we skipped it and jumped right to the rising action, you'd be even more confused at the end. And we're going to try and unconfusify you as much as possible. My last thing, do you know what a lottery is?
Where you
There you go.
lose it all.
So with a lottery, you guys are mostly making references to like the ones that you buy lottery tickets for, or the little scratch-offy lottery tickets. That's not the only kind of lottery. That's just the biggest one we put the big billboards up for. By definition, a lottery is just a thing where you have a chance of winning. There are other kinds of lotteries where you have a chance of winning a thing. There are entire book series written about the fact that there are lotteries and a chance of winning a thing. And so that would be another example of a lottery for those of you who recognize this particular lottery. Agreed. That's a great book. It deals with children killing children. It doesn't get much better. I will leave this wonderful image up for you as we get into our story. Let's take a look at the lottery. As we get into it, figuring out, again, the exposition-y things, who are the characters, where is it taking place, when's it taking place, stuff like that. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely, and the grass was richly green. The people of the village began to gather in the square between the post office and the bank around 10 o'clock. In some towns, there were so many people that the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 26th. But in this village, where there were only about 300 people, the whole lottery took less than 2 hours. So it could begin at 10 o'clock in the morning and still be through in time to allow the villagers to get home for noon dinner. Quick pause. When's it taking place?
June 27th.
I was going to go for summertime, but sure, June 27th. Where is it taking place?
In a village.
In a village. How big is the village?
300 people wide.
Now, to give you an idea of how big 300 people is, our school is around 1,000 people. Your lunch, whichever one you have, A, B, and C, they're each around 300 people, slightly more. So there are more people in your lunch than there are in this entire village. So it gives you an idea. Now, are all the villages small? No, because it says some of them have take 2 days to get through. Where just this story is taking place in a particularly small village of 300 people. The children assembled first, of course. School was recently over for the summer, and the feeling of liberty sat uneasily on most of them. They tended to gather together quietly for a while before they broke into boisterous play. Their talk was still of the classroom and the teacher, of books and records. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and the other boys soon followed his example. selecting the smoothest and roundest stones. Bobby and Harry Jones and Dickie Delacroix, the villagers pronounce his name Delacroix, eventually made a great pile of stones in one corner of the square and guarded it against the rays of the other boys. The girls stood aside, talking amongst themselves, looking over their shoulders at the boys, and the very small children rolled in the dust or clung to the hands of their older brothers or sisters. Now, a quick pause to make fun of children. What is it the boys are all doing? Yeah, they're running around and they're just playing with piles of rocks. And before we make fun of the boys too much, what are the girls doing?
Gossiping.
They're checking out the boys who are playing with rocks. So I'm not sure which one is worse, the boys who are running around playing with rocks on the ground, or the girls who are going, look at that boy playing with them rocks. And so both of them have issues before you start getting way too judgy. Oh, and except for the real small children, and what are the real small children doing? Yeah, doing what little kids do, just rolling around like a little Tasmanian devil, getting themselves all dirty. So far, kids being kids, special. Soon, the men began to gather, surveying their own children. Speaking of planting and rain, tractors and taxes, they stood together, away from the pile of stones in the corner, and their jokes were quiet, and they smiled rather than laughed. The women, wearing faded house dresses and sweaters, came shortly after the menfolk. They greeted one another and exchanged bits of gossip as they went to join their husbands. Soon, the women standing by their husbands began to call to their children, and the children came reluctantly, having to be called 4 or 5 times. Bobby Martin ducked under his mother's grasping hand and ran, laughing, back to the pile of stones. They really like those rocks. His father spoke up sharply, and Bobby came quickly and took his place between his father and his oldest brother. The lottery was conducted, as were the square dances, the teen club, and the Halloween program by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. He was a round-faced, jovial man, and he ran the coal business, and people felt sorry for him because he had no children, and his wife was a scold. Now, being a scold means you like to yell at people for fun. The nowadays reference would be, she's a Karen, so that's why they sort of feel bad for him. When he arrived in the square, carrying the black wooden box, there was a murmur of conversation among the villagers, and he waved and called, "Now I'm a little late today, folks." The postmaster, Mr. Graves, followed him, carrying a 3-legged stool, and the stool was put in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers set the black box down on it. The villagers kept their distance, leaving a space between themselves and the stool, and when Mr. Summers said, "Hey, can some of you fellows want to give me a hand?" there was a hesitation before 2 men, Mr. Martin and his oldest son, Baxter, came forward to hold the box steady on the stool while Mr. Summers stirred up the papers inside of it. To get rid of our picture of children killing children, if you've never seen a 3-legged stool, dang it, I forgot I had this picture. This is Noblesville, the town just north of us. Fishers doesn't have a town square. We have the town circle, where you have like the library, the fire station, and stuff like that. Noblesville has an actual town square. They have like a town hall, and they have an actual square that goes around it, and they'll have like all the shops that go around it. Noblesville's been around forever. So this is where the town is meeting. The people are all meeting. They have like this little grassy area, so they'd all just like be meeting in this area, getting together and talking. Bowen?
Do you think we could turn the entirety of Noblesville into a 3-legged stool?
We did. Look at that. Magic. So there's our 3-legged stool. They've also described what magical device they're going to use for this lottery. The device being?
The black box.
It's just a black
It's a
box.
black
And they mentioned what's in the black box.
Paper.
Paper.
Ooh, magical paper. That's all we know so far. The original paraphernalia, that's a fancy word meaning stuff connected to. The original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago. The black box, now resting on the stool, had been put into use even before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in town, was born. And Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. There was a story that the present box had been made with some pieces of the box that had preceded it, the one that had been constructed when the first people settled down to make a village here. Every year after the lottery, Mr. Summers began talking again about a new box, but every year the subject was allowed to fade off without anything being done. The black box grew shabbier each year. By now, it was no longer completely black, but splintered badly along one side to show the original wood color. Some places faded or stained. My quick question, how long have they been doing this lottery? Yeah, we don't even know. Forever and ever. Longer than Old Man Warner, who has the best name ever, because his first name is Old Man, which probably made him get bullied a lot as a child. But apparently they've been using it since even he was a child, when he used to be known as Little Man Warner. Mr. Martin and his oldest son, Baxter, held the black box securely on the stool until Mr. Summers had stirred the papers thoroughly with his hand. Because so much of the ritual had been forgotten or discarded, Mr. Summers had been successful in having slips of paper substituted for the chips of wood that had been used for generations. Chips of wood, Mr. Summers had argued, had been all very well when the village was tiny. But now that the population was more than 300 and likely to keep on growing, it was necessary to use something that would fit more easily into the black box. The night before the lottery, Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves made up the slips of paper and put them in the box, and it was then taken to the safe of Mr. Summers' coal company and locked up until Mr. Summers was ready to take it to the square the next morning. The rest of the year, the box was put away, sometimes one place, sometimes another. It spent 1 year in Mr. Graves' barn and another year underfoot in the post office. And sometimes it was set on a shelf in the Martin grocery, just left there. There was a great deal of fussing to be done before Mr. Summers declared the lottery open. There were the lists to make up of heads of families, heads of households in each family, members of each household in each family. There was the proper swearing in of Mr. Summers by the postmasters as the official of the lottery. At one time, some people remembered there had been a speech of some sort performed by the official of the lottery, a boring, tuneless chant that had been rattled off duly each year. Some people believe that the official of the lottery used to stand just so he said or sang it. Others believe that he was supposed to walk among the people, but years and years ago, this part of the ritual had been allowed to lapse. There had been also a ritual salute, which the official of the lottery had to use in addressing each person who came up to draw from the box. But this also had changed with time, until now it felt necessary only for the official to speak to each person approaching. Mr. Summers was very good at all this. In his clean white shirt and blue jeans with one hand resting carelessly on the black box, he seemed very proper and important as he talked interminably to Mr. Graves and the Martins. That's the end of our exposition. So the last thing was, they didn't always use paper. What did they used to use? Chunks of wood. But they were like, come on, man, we're like 300 people. We're humongous. You can't keep using chunks of wood. Instead, let's smash the chunks of wood flat. What do you call a flat chunk of wood?
Paper.
There you go. And they ended up going to paper. So with all this, there used to be a whole bunch of traditions that were connected to the lottery. Do they still do all those traditions?
Nope.
Do they even know why they did the traditions?
No.
Do they care?
No.
Is it just like you guys?
Yes.
Yes, it is. Now, let's get to the fun part. There we go. Just as Mr. Summers finally left off talking and turned to the assembled villagers, Mrs. Hutchinson came hurriedly along the path to the square, her sweater thrown over her shoulders and slid into place in the back of the crowd. I clean forgot what day it was, she said to Mrs. Delacroix, who stood next to her. They both laughed softly. Now, I thought my old man was out back stacking wood, Mrs. Hutchinson went on. And then I looked out the window, and the kids was gone, and I remembered, it's the 27th, and I came a-running. She dried her hands on her apron, and Mrs. Delacroix said, you're in time, Bill. You're still just talking away up there. Mrs. Hutchinson craned her neck to see through the crowd and found her husband and children standing near the front. She tapped Mrs. Delacroix on the arm as a farewell and began to make her way through the crowd. The people separated good-humoredly to let her through. 2 or 3 people said voices just loud enough to be heard across the crowd. Here comes your Mrs. Hutchinson and Bill. She made it after all. Mrs. Hutchinson reached her husband, and Mr. Summers, who had been waiting, said cheerfully, "I thought we were going to have to get on without you, Tessie." Mrs. Hutchinson said, grinning, "Wouldn't have me leave the dishes in the sink now, would you, Joe?" And soft laughter ran through the crowd as the people stirred back into position after Mrs. Hutchinson's arrival. And yes, our foreshadowing clues have already begun. "Well, now," Mr. Summers said soberly, "guess we better get started and get this over with so we can go back to work. Anybody ain't here?" Oh, not everyone in town gets to play the lottery. That's going to be my next question coming up, is figure out which are the special people who are the chosen ones. "Anybody ain't here? Dunbar, Dunbar, Dunbar." Mr. Summers consulted his list. "Clyde Dunbar. That's right, he's broke his leg, hasn't he? All right, who's drawing for him?" "Me, I guess," the woman said. Mr. Summers turned to look at her. "Wife draws for her husband," Mr. Summers said. "Now, don't you have a grown boy to do it for you, Jane?" Although Mr. Summers and everyone else in the village knew the answer perfectly well, it was the business of the official of the lottery to ask such questions formally. Mr. Summers waited with an expression of polite interest while Mrs. Dunbar answered. "Horace is not but 16 yet. Guess I got to fill in for the old man this year." "Right," Mr. Summers said. He made a note on the list he was holding. Then he asked, "Is the Watson boy drawing this year?" A tall boy in the crowd raised his hand. "Here, I'm drawing for my mother and me." Feels like I nailed that voice. He blinked his eyes nervously and ducked his head as several voices in the crowd said things like, "You're a good fella, Jack, and glad to see your mother's got a man to do it." "Well," Mr. Summers said, "yes, that's everyone. Now, did old man Warner make it?" "Here," a voice said, and Mr. Summers nodded. Sudden hush fell on the crowd as Mr. Summers cleared his throat and looked at the list. "All right, now I'm going to read the names, heads of families first. Men, come up. You take a paper out of the box. Keep the paper folded in your hand without looking at it until everyone has had a turn. Everything clear?" Let's make sure. Is everything clear? So who in the town gets to play? Just the menfolk, and that is it. Unless you are missing a manfolk in your family, then who gets to play? Not the wife. The oldest son. But the oldest son has to be of a certain age. We don't know how old that is, because apparently Horace is only 16, and 16 is not old enough yet. So my guess is probably 18, but they never actually tell us what that age is. If you don't have a man to play, and you don't have an oldest son to play, then who gets to play? That's where the women come in, and now the women get to play. They don't talk about daughters, because apparently no one cares about them. They don't get to play. So of this, my next question is, have you been picking up on foreshadowing clues that give you a guess as to what you think the lottery wins?
Yes.
What's my yes? Do we have any guesses of what the lottery is going to be? Just staring at me. Taylin?
I don't have a guess, but this feels like the movie. I don't have a guess, but this feels like the movie The Village. Like, I don't know why. Whenever you started talking about it, I started just like.
The Village, is that the one where they have like a person who has like the blind girl who escapes?
Yeah.
I don't know what you're talking about that one.
Yeah.
I can see that because it has that same like old towny kind of feel thing to it. I can pick up on that. There's definitely going to be some connections between the two of them. They're both in a village and they both have a girl in them. And maybe a person who's blind. That I could be lying about though. Bowen!
I hope they win some smoked ribs.
Why smoked ribs?
Because I really like them.
Well, then I wish them the best of luck on their winning of the smoked ribs.
Me too.
But, time-wise, that's where we're going to stop. Home, children, we're going to stop there. We're not even into the suspense part yet. The suspense part's coming. When we start figuring out who gets to come up and draw, and we start getting to our winner and stuff like that. But that's for tomorrow. Toopsies!